So Ansible is built, especially when we start talking about Ansible Tower, right, which I'm going to show you, is built in a way that you have to collaborate, right? Um, if you want to get the full value out of it. And that's what we specialize in, is teaching you how to do that, right? So we have other customers. I can think of one right now that's just doing an amazing job where they formed like an automation practice, and they have this weekly meeting, and they bring together all like the stakeholders from all the different departments. You have like 5 or 6 people, there's like a Windows person, a storage person that comes, there's a network person, and they talk about what they're building, and they share the code via Git repos, and I'm going to go into that. But that's the secret sauce for me, is the Git repos, and Ansible Tower utilizes these Git repos, and you literally start running your IT department kind of like a software developer's like. You start using the same tools that they use to write a lot of these apps with, right? So they write it in Git, they do Git commits, and they do pull requests and merges, and we can get into all that. But that's the secret sauce that kind of breaks down all the silos. So literally, you can have a new hire come in, right? And instead of having to sort of sit with someone who's putting out fires all day for a month to get ramped up, you can show them the Git repo, and they can see every person that committed a new playbook, the comments. Maybe the playbook got denied, and there was a comment like, we're going in a different direction. Can you rewrite it to do this or something? They can start to see kind of who the rock stars are in the different departments, right? So if you get into like automated ticketing, there might be someone who's really good at ServiceNow, and that person writes all the ServiceNow playbooks. And instead of having to work there for 5 years and figure out who that person is, and you can look in the Git repo and go, oh, this is the person who fixes all the bugs that come up in our ticketing playbooks. I can see them. Like over the last year, they've done all the commits, right? To add new features and to fix things and stuff. So it's like it just makes everything visible, and everybody gets to collaborate. But I'll move on. We'll get to that once we get over to Tower. I'll talk more about that. But you might be asking, like, what is Tower, right? You've kind of probably heard of Ansible. So Ansible is kind of like the automation language, right? It's also an open source project that you could go out and find on GitHub, right? Because we use these same practices where we develop through the open source community on GitHub, and you could actually go in there, and for like the networking modules, you can actually see the person who's committing all the code and adding new features, and if people open issues, you can see who responds back, and you'll find out there's like little rock stars for each little area, right? And you can see it all, and that's the kind of the beauty of open source. And so you're actually able to take some of that into your own company, but behind the company's firewall, right? So we would actually call that inner source, where you're working in this open source manner, and you're getting all the value of open source. But of course, it's proprietary, and it's behind the company firewall, right? But anyway, so Ansible is that automation framework, right? The actual Python code that's running these modules to help you automate, right? Now, Ansible Tower is our enterprise framework. So Ansible Tower is how you bring Ansible into production and keep it secure, right? Keep it scalable, keep it controllable. So you can imagine two different scenarios. One I would call kind of like the Wild Wild West, where everybody just pip installs Ansible onto their laptops. They're all sitting in their different cubicles. They're all writing playbooks, not talking to each other. They're running on devices, right? Automating the network. But then you start to ask yourself, where are the logs going for all these playbooks you're running? Oh, well, they're just on my laptop. Oh, okay. That's not going to work, right? And then you could say, well, who approved that playbook? Who decided that that's the automation we want running on our network? Nobody, right? It's just on my laptop. I wrote it, right? And that's how everybody starts. Typically, I started like that, but in my home lab, right? But when we talk about production, that's where Ansible Tower came in. So we have this enterprise framework where we can integrate with all this different stuff, right? So we integrate with Git and GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket or whatever flavor of Git you're using. And that's where the playbooks are, right? And so we can control what playbooks get ran. We can look at them before we decide to bring them into our network. We can do centralized logging, where we pipe all of the logs for the entire cluster, right? Because typically that's how we would install Ansible Towers in a cluster, right? So maybe like 3 nodes or something like that. Put it behind a load balancer, And then all those nodes have centralized logging that go into Splunk, right? So our security team's happy. We say no automation will run anywhere except for this cluster, and all the logs from this cluster are going into Splunk, right? Now, we also provide a RESTful API. So we see a lot of customers driving the automation through maybe a different platform. Not in the first year probably, but maybe in the second year you say, hey, we have Slack and we want to be able to fire off playbooks from Slack, and then Slack just goes and talks to Tower and then runs it, and then it's an approved playbook, the logs go to Splunk, but we're just driving it from Slack, or we're driving it from ServiceNow, or we're driving it from wherever, right? Through Tower's RESTful API. So you can kind of see where Tower fits in as that enterprise framework. Lets us bring this into production. It does have a lot of features, like it allows you to use dynamic inventory, right? So we would just use a script that pulls the inventory from SolarWinds. That way it's fresh every single time that we run a playbook. So people continue to manage those devices the same way they always have. If they provision a new switch, they go and put it in SolarWinds. If they decommission a switch, an old switch, they take it out of SolarWinds. You never touch Ansible or Ansible Tower. So if someone adds a bunch of new switches, it doesn't break any of the automation. They're just automatically in there, right? It's automated. We're using what's called a dynamic inventory script. Now, we also have role-based access control. So the same thing, if you add a new employee or an employee moves to a different team, you don't come into Ansible Tower and have to make a manual change every time. You automate that. So what we do is we integrate with LDAP. And then as soon as you have someone who joins your team, the first time they log into Ansible Tower, we can see what group they're a member of in Active Directory. And then we just map that group to a team in Ansible Tower. And we say, well, you're on the network team, so you can see all the network inventories, the network playbooks, the network credentials. But then if you change teams and the next week you log in and you're associated with the Windows group, you no longer see the networking stuff. Now you see the Windows inventory, credential, etc., right? Playbooks. We can also do things like, running playbooks at scale. So, you're probably not at this point yet, but if you ever start getting into like OpenShift or Kubernetes, which may happen over the next like 5 years, right? You can actually point Ansible Tower at Kubernetes or at OpenShift, and it will actually run the playbooks. It'll spin up pods and run the playbooks there. Now, also for running playbooks at scale, we have a lot of features, even if you're not using, OpenShift yet. We have the ability to run on a cluster, like I said. So as you have multiple teams coming in, they can hit like an F5 load balancer or something and then get spread out amongst the cluster. Typically, you start with like 3 nodes. Also, we have what's called job slicing. So if you're going to run a really big playbook with a big inventory, you can set your job slicing to 3 and utilize all 3 nodes, right, if you need to. You can do a lot of fine tuning with that. You can say, hey, every device in this subnet I want to run on this box, etc., right? So it allows you to really start to scale. I already mentioned we do have that RESTful API if you want to drive the automation to some other tool. So every single time you create a template, which I'm about to show you, in Ansible Tower, you get a little launch button. So you can log into Tower. Well, I can find out what team you're mapped to. You get to see those playbooks. I can scroll through the playbooks to find the one I want to run. Once I get to that screen, there's a little button that says launch. I hit that button, the playbook launches. Now, every time there's a little button that says launch, there's also an API endpoint. So I could launch that from really anywhere, right? Slack or ServiceNow, anything that could run really like a curl command and pass over like an authorization token could launch off that Ansible playbook. So keep that in mind. Ansible and Ansible Tower are 2 separate things. Ansible Tower sort of stacks on top of Ansible. So if a new version of Ansible comes out, you don't have to upgrade Ansible Tower. If a new version of Ansible Tower comes out, you don't have to change the version of Ansible that all your playbooks are using, right? So much so that we use something called virtual environments within Ansible Tower, and you could be running 3 or 4 different versions of Ansible, and there's just a little drop-down menu on your playbook that says, hey, I want to run this one in Ansible 2.8. That way, if a new version of Ansible comes out, you don't have to switch everything over right away and say, oh man, they upgraded it and now this one playbook doesn't work anymore. No, you just create a new virtual environment, put the new version of Ansible in there, and then test all your playbooks on it on your dev tower, right? If you're confident that they all work, you could just go over and change the drop down from 2.8 to 2.9, right? It's really great. A lot of the features that they have built in here. We do have a lot of integrations. I've mentioned a lot of these already, just so far. So Splunk, right? Centralized logging in Splunk. Not only that, but there's also Splunk modules, so your Splunk team can start to automate Splunk with Tower. GitHub, okay? This could be GitLab, it could be Bitbucket, it could be Azure DevOps, whichever flavor of Git you're using. We're definitely going to want you to integrate with Git to get that full value of that collaboration and, you know, managing the code in a place where code should be managed, right? F5 load balancer there, you know, in front of the cluster. Talking to a CMDB, that's probably like ServiceNow or something. You know, we can write into ServiceNow or we can pull from ServiceNow. I wrote a bunch of blogs about automated ticketing with ServiceNow, and they've been a really big hit. You know, nobody likes to make tickets. Why not turn that into just like an extra task at the end of the playbook, right? And then that way, you know, the ticket always gets created, the correct information always gets filled out. It never gets overlooked in like an outage situation or something like that. And if there's any other integrations you want to talk about, like CyberArk or anything like that, just let me know. But in the meantime, what I'd like to do is jump over to Ansible Tower. Hold on one sec. Let me log in here. I got timed out of it. So this is Ansible Tower. So I was running a few playbooks before we started. If you've ever ran an Ansible playbook like on the command line, this is basically what it looks like. So you still see that within this kind of window on the right-hand side here. But what you also see when you run an Ansible playbook in Tower is all these details on the left-hand side. So let's take a look at what these are telling us, right? So what was the status? Well, we had a green dot, so we know that one was successful. It shows exactly what time the playbook started, exactly what time it finished. So it looks like this one took 15 seconds to run. We can see the name of the job template, which I'm going to get into. I'll show you how you create those. The job type. So within Ansible, you can set it to run or to check. Right? If you set it to check and the module supports that, it'll act like it. You know, it'll try to run it and it'll tell you if it would have failed or not, but it won't actually make any changes on the device. In this case, I set it to run, so it actually does make changes on the device. I can see the user that it was launched by, the inventory, right? So in your case, this could be like a SolarWinds inventory from a dynamic inventory script. In my case, I just hard-coded one for the demo. I put 4 Cisco devices in an inventory within Tower. In production, you don't want to do that, right? Because if I have 4, that's fine. But if I have 4,000 or 400, man, you don't want to be changing those in 2 different places, right? You want to have a single source of truth for that inventory. And typically, that's my first question is, what's a good source of truth for your inventory? And typically for networking, it is SolarWinds. For other teams, it'll probably be other things. But each team can have their own dynamic inventory, and you could even have multiple dynamic inventories that all get munged together into one. So you could pull from 3 different places. You definitely want to make sure that the devices don't overlap. So maybe half of the devices are listed here and half are listed over there, and we munge them together. But we don't want like, hey, well, they're all in here and they're all in here, because then you want to have a single source of truth. I can tell you that from the beginning. And sometimes Ansible Tower or Ansible will point out stuff like that for you that you can go and get resolved, some technical debt sometimes. Right here, it shows the project. The project in Ansible Tower is a Git repo. Okay, you can just, in your mind, instead of saying project, just think Git repo. That's all project is. And I'm going to show you those. But in this case, it shows you what project and then what revision the Git repo was on when this playbook ran, right? Because I could have made a change in the 20 minutes it's taken since I ran this, and now the code could be different in that Git repo. So you want to be able to look through and see exactly which revision of the Git repo you were on, which playbook, right? So all the playbooks are YAML files. Which credential? A credential is just a password, right, in this case. And typically that's where you start with credentials. They're passwords, but really what they are is just variables that you don't want to put in your Git repo because they're secrets, right? So instead of putting them in your Git repo, you put a variable in the Git repo, and then you just give that variable a value here in Ansible Tower under the credentials field. Right, so let's pop over there real quick. So in this case, I used the Cisco credential. So what this is here is I've created a credential. It's called a machine credential. Typically for SSH, we call those ones machine credentials. And there's a, you hit the magnifying glass and there's going to be a big list of all these different credentials you can choose from. In my case, I chose the machine credential. And here I'm just giving it a value. I put in the username. Now I could have just put a password in here. And if I would have hit save, it would have been grayed out and said encrypted. But instead of using a password, I'm just using an SSH key. So what I did is I just pasted the SSH key in here. As soon as I hit save, this gets grayed out and says encrypted. Now I have a saved credential. The cool part about this is I can attach this to my playbooks, or I can share this with my entire team. If I just go up to permissions, I could say I want to share this credential with the entire network team. Okay, then whenever a networking person logs in, they go to credentials. Oh, look, the Cisco credential is in my list. But hey, I can't see what the actual SSH key is, or I can't see what the actual password is, but I just have access to use it. So I kind of thought that was an interesting way of doing things. I'd never really come across that previously in my career, where you have access to a password and you can attach it to things, but you don't actually get to see it. I thought that was kind of cool. As you progress down the journey of automation, you can actually even move this off to a source of truth. So typically that would be something like CyberArk. So instead of storing the password in here, because it's the same scenario, our devices are changing all the time. Our team members are changing all the time, right? Our playbooks, they're changing all the time, right? So what do? We store our devices in SolarWinds and we use a dynamic inventory script. So if people add devices or remove devices, it doesn't break our automation. Well, we get our user information from Active Directory or LDAP. Right? So if users move teams or we get new hires, it doesn't break our automation, right? Same thing for our playbooks. We can modify our playbooks all the time, but since we're just pulling from the Git repo and getting the new revision fresh every single time, you can change playbooks all day long. It never breaks our automation. Okay, so now think about that, but for passwords. What if the security team has a stringent rule where they say, we're going to rotate the passwords every hour, right? Well, we can't be coming into Tower every hour to update that. So what do? We use a source of truth like CyberArk for the passwords. We tell the security team, fine, you change it in CyberArk every hour, and what I'm going to do is just make a CyberArk credential, and then whenever I run a playbook, as soon as I hit the launch button, I pull my fresh inventory, I pull my fresh playbook, and I pull my fresh password, and I run my automation. So they could rotate that password every hour. It never breaks our automation. It's a pattern, right? Everything we're doing, we're going to be using a source of truth. And then Ansible is just that glue in the middle. Ansible Tower is just gluing together this stuff. And so what we're going to do in Ansible Tower is use templates. Because you might be asking yourself, well, how do I take an Ansible playbook and then bring that into Tower and then launch that? Well, let me show you. So we're going to do something called a job template. So I've pre-created a bunch of them. But what a job template does is it just glues together basically like three things. Okay, so here's my inventory, and I can just pick this with the magnifying glass out of all the inventories that I have access to. In production, this might be like 5 or 10. In this case, I just have one in there. So I select my inventory. Now my project is right here. So again, project is just a Git repo. So I just choose the Git repo that I've set up previously under the project section. As soon as I choose the project, now I have this drop down. So what Tower does is it goes to that Git repo, and it clones it, pulls it down, and then it shows me all the .yaml files that exist in that Git repo, which is kind of cool because in a Git repo, you might have all kinds of different files, but it filters them out and only shows you the .yaml files. So I just choose whichever playbook I want. In this case, I chose like this config.yaml. And then here's my credentials. I hit the magnifying glass. I choose whatever credentials. There's like a bunch of different kinds. So if we go to machine credentials, okay, I've chosen the Cisco credential. It could be that I want to add ticketing, so I could also then go add the ServiceNow credential on there. I could come down here and hit save, and now that ServiceNow credential and Cisco credential are attached to that. Now again, just like when I created that credential, I can permission it. I could do the same thing with this template. I just go up to permissions and I can say share this with the networking team. And then if you're on the networking team, when you log in and you hit templates, hey, it's in this list of templates, right? I've showed you templates. I've showed you credentials, right? Credentials are just encrypted variables. You can kind of consider them passwords when you first get started because that's typically the first things you'll start to store in there. Templates is kind of where you glue together the playbook, the credential, the inventory. Now projects, like I said, a project is really just a Git repo. So you can see it's this simple. Here's my project. I gave it a name, right? I chose that it is a Git repo. And then I just put in the URL for the Git repo. And this Git repo is actually right here. It's on the public GitHub. And so that's why I say you should keep your playbooks in Git repos because there's a lot of value. So like right here, I'm using what's called like a GitHub action. And I'm actually linting all my playbooks, and I have a little badge that shows me. Now there's a lot of other stuff you can do. Like I could do like a pull request. So if I wanted to add a playbook in here, and I could write the code. I could come in here and I basically fork the repo, change the code, and then I come in and do a pull request. And then you guys can elect like an approval committee that would then go look at the playbook that the person wants to add. If it looks good and it passes all the tests, you just hit a green button that says merge, and then all of a sudden that playbook gets added to this repo, and then Tower can now see that playbook. But it's all tracked now. So you can see who submitted it, at what time, what exact lines of code did they change. There's like green pluses and red minuses, you know. And then you can see, well, who approved it? And hey, did it pass the automation checks? Like we can run a linter on there and make sure that all the spacing is correct in Ansible and all that stuff. And then if it passes, then the person approves it. You can see it and it's all recorded, and you can go back for like years and see every change that's been made to your automation. It's really cool. Now you can start to store your configs in here too, right? So like one thing I'm doing is let me show you this playbook real quick. Okay, so this is one I've just kind of been experimenting with. So if I go to launch this, I have 4 Cisco switches that I've built into an inventory. They're running on AWS right now. So as soon as I hit launch, now you can see that it's kicking off. It's running like probably what you're used to seeing if you've ever used Ansible. It's running over here on the right-hand side in this little box. Now you can see I'm getting back different colors, right? So for the 4 devices, I tried to put in like the no service pad, and I got back green OKs, meaning like that configuration was already there, so no change was needed. I tried to put in IPSSH version 2. That was already there, so no change, was needed. So it just came back with a green OK. But then when I got back, I'm actually pushing a command from a file because I wanted to show you that, and that one is actually coming back with an amber changed. So it's kind of cool. You can see like which ones did it add and which ones did it change. But so if we go and we look now, which playbook? This was the config.yaml from the Cisco STIG. This is when I just started playing around with like writing some SIG stuff. So if we look at this config.yaml, here's the playbook. This is the exact playbook I just showed you. At the top here, we have like the top level. So that says, run on all the hosts in the inventory. My inventory was 4 hosts. It ran on all of them. I just turned off gather facts. Gather facts is actually really useful. If I would have put that to yes, it would have gathered a lot of facts off of each one of those devices. And I could have actually programmatically written that into my playbook later and said, hey, if it's iOS version 15, then run this command. But if it's 12, then run that command, And I would have found that out based off of gathering the facts. So I could run it on an inventory of 400 switches, and for each switch, it'll make its own decision because it gathers the facts off of there. But I just set some variables here that just show my connection type. I'm actually experimenting with a new connection type that's supposed to be like way faster. And then right here, I'm just telling Ansible that it's a Cisco iOS device. And probably not important to you guys, but I'm using like our new format that's new for this year. Trying to playing around with some of the new format. And then really I'm just doing a no service pad, IPSSH version 2. So I can enter these commands one at a time in this fashion, or what I could do, I could put everything into one file and then push the file over. So if we take a look at basic config.j2, this is a Jinja 2 file, so we call it .j2. right now I only put one command in here, the no IP domain lookup, but you could put an entire config in there. Now it's going to take a little finessing and testing and making sure that it all works correctly. You want to be able to push a config, and what I'll do typically is break the config into different pieces and then push those pieces kind of one at a time. So in your case, like you could have a whole QoS like file, and it's just only the QoS configs, and then you could have a playbook that pushes that. So if you're going up against a device that's having some QoS problems, you could run that playbook, and then it could come back, and it could be like all these green lines and then one yellow line. You'd be like, oh, that one config was missing. You know what I mean? And you could see which one it was. And but just think about that. There's multiple ways that you could do this. You can push commands one at a time. You could push a whole entire file full of commands. But yeah, like I said, my recommendation would be to break them into pieces and have like a QoS file, right? Have a AAA file, have an SNMP file, a logs file, and then the cool thing is if you start keeping track of that in Git, then every time someone changes one of those, it's tracked. You can be like, oh yeah, look, a year ago we changed our QoS config. It was done by this person. It was approved by this person. This is what time it happened. And then if you ever have any issues, you can go back and be like, hey, we need to roll back, right? So you can just roll back to the older config in there.